Hey everyone, today I'm going to teach you how to make Italian wedding soup. Here's what you'll need. For the soup, you'll need olive oil, a small onion, carrots, celery, chicken stock, escarole, baby spinach, a small pasta, salt and pepper to taste. For the meatballs, you're going to need ground turkey, grated Parmesan, breadcrumbs, an egg, garlic, parsley, and salt and pepper to taste. To start, I'm going to peel my carrots. You can hand wash them if you want, but it takes a lot of scrubbing, so I find that it's easier to just peel the skins off. Once you've peeled all of your carrots, you're going to chop off the ends. You're going to cut it into a piece that's a little more manageable, and then you're going to dice them into small cubes. They don't have to be perfect. Mine definitely aren't. But your goal is to get them to all be roughly the same size so that they cook at the same speed. Next, I'm going to chop up my celery. So I'm going to start by cutting off the ends. The top bit gets kind of dry and the bottom sometimes hangs onto dirt in the little nooks and crannies. I have washed them, but it still usually has a little bit of dirt in there. So these I'm going to chop so that they're about the same size as the carrots. So before I started, I noticed that my celery was really flimsy, so I'm going to teach you a little trick. You should chop off the end, place it in some water, and then put it in the refrigerator. This will crisp your celery right back up to normal. Next, we're going to chop our onions. So we're going to start by cutting the ends off and then cutting it in half so that it's easier to peel. After I peel it, I start chopping it up. And I'm going to try and make it about the same size as what the carrots and the celery are so that they all cook at the same speed. So this is escarole. It comes in a really big head. It's fluffy, it's kind of messy, but I try my best to chop it in half because we only need half of this head of escarole. So after I chop it in half, I get the other half out of the way. And then I work on cutting the little stump ends off. That's not going to taste good, so we want to get that out of there. So make sure that you get any of those hard stump ends out of there. And then next I just roughly chop it. Now this isn't going to be exactly the same size as the carrot, celery, and onion, but I try and kind of get it to be about the same size. It's not easy because it's so fluffy, but I gave it my best shot. So since this escarole wasn't washed ahead of time, I place it in a strainer, which I then put in a pot of water so that the dirt can kind of fall to the bottom as it soaks. So while the escarole soaks, I turn my stove on to medium heat. I have a big pot on top and I put a little olive oil in to get that heating up. To test if the pan's hot, I put a little piece of onion in there. I turn on the light so that I can see it better. And I wait until that starts to sizzle. Once that little piece of onion starts to sizzle, I know that it's hot enough for me to add the rest of my onion. So you can see the little bubbles. It's ready for the rest of the onion to go in. I let this saute for a little while. Your goal is for the onion to kind of start to soften. This should take about 2 minutes. Once the onion is cooked for about 2 minutes, I add my carrots and my celery. These are going to saute for about another 2 minutes. You'll want to keep them moving around so that they don't start to burn or anything. But you're going to look for those to start to soften as well. So now that those have cooked for 2 minutes, they've started to soften, I add in my chicken stock. So I have 2 containers that are 32 ounces each. I'm going to add those in. Make sure that you shake them first. You want to make sure that any of the concentrate hasn't sunk to the bottom. If it has, you want to make sure it gets mixed in there. Once the stock is all added, I'm going to give it a little stir, and then I'm going to bring it up to a boil. Once it reaches a boil, I'm going to let it boil for 20 minutes. While the soup boils, I'm going to start working on my meatballs. I start by roughly chopping up some parsley. We're going to need a total of a handful. I know that's pretty vague, but it's about what we need. This isn't exact with how much parsley, but a handful seems to be the right amount. I want to make sure that I finely chop this up. We don't want any huge chunks of parsley in our meatballs. So now that my parsley is all chopped, I start chopping up some bread to make some breadcrumbs. So these two little end pieces of bread have been sitting out for a little over 24 hours, so they're super dry. So now what my goal is to basically chop them up as finely as I can. So I start by cutting them in strips, then I turn it and cut the strips into smaller pieces. And then after I cut it into smaller pieces, I kind of just go over it all and I roughly chop it as much as I can. You really want to make sure that you get these into really small pieces. You don't want any big hunks of bread in your meatballs. That's going to give it a weird texture. So now that we've got our breadcrumbs all done, it's time to assemble our meatballs. So I start by putting my turkey into a medium-sized bowl. Next, I'm going to measure in my cup of breadcrumbs. These two end pieces seem to be just about exactly a cup, so that worked out really perfectly. Once the breadcrumbs are in there, I'm going to add in my grated Parmesan. I'm going to need a cup of this as well. I used the full cup measuring cup. I kind of wished that I had used maybe 2 half cups so that it was a little easier to scoop. I wasn't able to get a very accurate measurement this way. So I did my best to measure a cup, and then I did a little extra for good measure just in case. It's always better to have more cheese than less. Next, I crack my egg right into the bowl. It's always a good idea to crack your egg on a flat surface. If you do it on the edge of a bowl, you risk forcing bacteria into the egg. So next, I'm going to add my garlic. So usually I would use 2 cloves of garlic. But I have the pre-minced stuff, so I'm going to use that. So if you're using the pre-minced stuff, you're going to want to use 1 teaspoon. That equals about 2 cloves. Next goes in the parsley. If you happen to notice any large pieces in there, you can take them out or you can kind of tear them apart. I was really careful with chopping this, so I didn't have too many. So next you're going to add your salt and pepper to taste. So if you don't want it super salty, don't add a ton of salt. If you don't want it super peppery, don't add a ton of pepper. And now it's time to mix. So I did this by hand. You could totally use a fork or a spoon, but I find that it's easier to get everything mixed together if I just use my hands to mix it. So now our meatball mix is really well combined. There aren't any big chunks of anything left in there, no clumps or anything like that. So we can start forming these into meatballs. So you can make your meatballs however big you want to. I usually make mine about a teaspoon, but you want to keep in mind that when you add these to your broth, they're going to grow a little bit. Not a ton, but they do swell. They absorb some of the broth that's in the soup. So you want to make sure that you keep that in mind when you decide how big you want them. So our soup is boiling. It's been boiling for 20 minutes, which means that it's ready for the meatballs to go in. You can see that that meatball mix made a whole bunch of meatballs. So I'm going to start dropping them in. You want to make sure that you don't stack them right on top of each other as much as possible. It's going to happen because there are a lot of meatballs, but to the best of your ability, try not to stack them. And you're going to notice that as they cook, they start to float. That's good, that's what you're looking for, that's how you know that they're cooking. So once we get all of our meatballs added, we're going to bring this back up to a boil. Once this comes back up to a boil, we're going to add in our escarole. And we're going to let both of these cook at a boil for a total of 10 minutes. At that point, the escarole should be cooked and the meatballs should be thoroughly cooked through. So when I've got it all mixed in and all of the escarole seems to be pretty well coated in broth, I'm going to put a top on. I'm going to kind of angle it a little bit so that some steam can escape, and I'm going to let it cook. So our soup has been cooking for about 5 minutes now. I've been stirring it occasionally just to make sure that none of the meatballs are sticking to the bottom and none of the escarole is stuck to the sides. This is a good time to add the pasta, but before you add your pasta, you want to make sure to taste it and see if you have to add any salt or pepper, because the pasta will absorb flavor and you want to make sure that it's good flavor. So from here, I taste it. I decided that it needed quite a bit of pepper because I prefer a more peppery soup, but that's completely up to you. And it needed a little bit of salt, not a ton. So after I've got all of that in there, I give it a good stir. And then it's time to add the pasta. So what kind of pasta you use is really up to you. It's traditional to use something really small, like a cini di pepe, like what I used, or pastina. Anything that's really little like that is what's traditional for an Italian wedding soup. So now I'm going to put the cover back on and I'm going to let it cook for about 2 or 3 more minutes. So now that we've cooked for 2 or 3 more minutes, it's time to add our spinach. So I add a whole bag of spinach. Make sure that you're keeping an eye as you pour in the spinach because there definitely are some funky pieces in there. It's bound to happen. You also want to make sure if there are any dirty pieces, you get those out too. It says that they're triple washed, but you never really know. So I added about half of the bag and I'm going to stir it in. And once that looks kind of wilted, I'm going to add the other half of the bag. But I'm going to let this cook for a second before I do. So the first half of the spinach is looking nice and wilted. So now it's time for me to add the other half. I'm basically going to do the same thing. I'm going to pour all these in. I'm going to keep an eye out for any gross pieces so that I can pick those out. I'm going to give this a little stir and I'm going to let it cook until this batch of spinach is wilted as well. And then the soup is basically done. So I give it a stir, let it get all mixed in. The spinach, you want to make sure that it stays nice and bright and green. You don't want to overcook it so that it gets kind of dark and gross. You just barely want it to be wilted, and that'll be perfect. So just to make sure that everything is done, I grab a meatball and I cut it in half. You always want to double check and make sure that any meat in your dish is cooked. So you can see that the meatball is cooked through, which means we're done. So I'm going to serve this up in a nice big bowl. I'm going to get a little bit of everything in there. And then personally, I like to top mine off with a little sprinkle of Parmesan cheese. To me, it just adds that little extra bit of salt that just makes it perfect. And then that's it. You've got your Italian wedding soup. Let me know if you guys make this at home. It's one of my favorites.